Welcome to the Charlevoix Stories Project, a continuation of the Charlevoix Histories oral tradition. Today is February 16th, 2016, and we are at the Charlevoix Public Library in Charlevoix, Michigan. I am David Miles, and our videographer is Rick Pierpont of Pierpont Productions in Harbor Springs, Michigan. With me are Phyllis Williams-Elzinga and Don Heisey of Charlevoix, and we will be talking about our years of working at Williams Cigar Store, which was owned by Phyllis's father. So on my left is Phyllis Williams-Elzinga, and to her left is Don Heisey. So we will get started by talking about the importance of the store to the community of Charlevoix, because Joe's actually served as a community center, mainly because it was so popular with so many people, because there was so much there available 365 days a year. I don't think the store ever closed, even for the holidays. I can remember working myself on Christmas Day, because there were people in town who needed their newspapers, they needed their Cokes, they needed their little nuts and bolts and whatever supplies for entertaining. So the store actually served, as I said, as a community center, and I will then ask Phyllis about her recollections of the number of people that came into the store, what they did. I think that Joe probably knew everybody in town.
I'm sure he did, and he called them by name.
Right.
And that always made you feel special, he thought. And people from all walks of life came, and like you said, they needed their newspaper, some of them needed their cigars, and their Cokes, and their mixed nuts out of the mixed nut machine, because that was kind of unique in those days. The center with the special deluxe mixes went around, and it was sort of unique, and people sort of stood there and watched, and then they had to buy some, so that was always fun. But as David said, people from all walks of the community, and chauffeurs from the resort families would come to get their newspapers and their cigars and maybe pick up a few other items that they needed. But it was just people from all walks of life. And it was a joy to be there and see them all.
Don?
Well, where to start? It was quite a play. It certainly was the center of the community. It was not an emporium for sure, but it was the hub of the town, and I remember it as being mostly a male crowd, guys coming in to get their newspapers, but there were always the bank ladies who sat
Right.
back at the
Right.
at the back counter, but the chauffeurs were some of the more entertaining guys that came in there.
That's true.
I remember Johnny. I don't remember what his last name was.
Johnny Wilkes.
Yes, he was just fantastic. You look forward to summers to seeing Johnny every day come in, and the store wasn't very big. I don't know if I should get into this, but I'll bet that store wasn't 12 feet wide. It was
Probably not. It was long
very,
and narrow.
very narrow, but it had everything. And the word unique came up, and the thing I remember the most, well, something's either unique or it isn't, and those front doors in the summertime.
Oh, yeah.
They had doors that came to in the middle of the doorway, came to a V, and they opened on both sides and then met back in the middle again. How those ever came, I never saw those in my life again.
Or since.
Or, yeah, and they slammed, man, I remember that.
And they squeaked, so you knew when somebody was coming into the store and when somebody was exiting. Don mentioned the chauffeur, Johnny Wilkes. The arrival of the chauffeurs for the resorters signaled the beginning of summertime. And they usually arrived within a week of each other, and they would all come in. Only one of them was white. So we lived in a small town that had no black population at all. So we were rather isolated from the racism that infested the rest of the country. And we made good friends with these people. Race simply was not an issue. So when I went to the University of Michigan in 1958, I came up against racism for the first time, and it was a shock to me because I had been with these people who had come every year. We had become fast friends, and I was rather taken aback at what I found. And of course, then I became rather conversant with the reality of the country at the time. But getting back to Johnny Wilkes, Johnny had a pet parakeet that he kept on his shoulder, and nobody knew how he could drive through town with his pet parakeet and walk Bridge Street without it flying away. We had actually women screaming when they saw him, girls bursting into tears because they thought this bird was on the verge of disappearing. But he had a secret, and he had trained this bird to play with Viceroy cigarettes that he kept in his breast pocket, either in his uniform or his shirt. And it was only Viceroys that this bird loved. So if Johnny kept these cigarettes here, the bird could see them from his shoulder, and the bird would look down, and he would come into the store after terrorizing some people out in the street with his bird and laughing his fool head off about what he had done. But this went on year after year, and that was the secret of Johnny's parakeet pet. So now, getting down to the phone. One thing you will do not have in any store today is free access to a local phone for any time you wanted it to make a local call. And one of my fondest memories of the phone was in 1959, which was my last season there. I had just come up after my first year in Michigan, and about 2 days before I arrived was the announcement that Charlevoix was going to be the site of the construction of the nation's 5th and Michigan's 1st atomic power plant at Big Rock Point, north of town. And women back at that time, older women, dressed, as we call them, sensible suits, sensible shoes, very blocky, very plain, and they had fox stoles around their neck and little hats with netting on it. This was the formal wear for relatively affluent women at the time. Well, this woman, I can't remember her name, came bursting into the store after this announcement that the atomic plant was coming. Her hair was in a mess, her hat was disheveled, it looked like she had done very quickly put the hat on and messed her hair all up. She was totally Twitter-pated, wanting to use the phone, and she got on and she said to whoever was on the other end, "Did you hear the news? Ed Shanahan has sold some of his property. There's going to be an atomic plant here in Charlevoix." Pause. "Don't you know what that means?" Pause. "The atomic smoke is going to kill all the flowers in town." And callow 19-year-old I was at the time, I remember looking at her and thinking, "Lady, there are people in this town also, you know." She was concerned only about the effect on the flowers. Don and I have a little bit to say about opening up the store. We had to do it every single day of the year. Rain, sunshine, snow, sleet, blizzards, whatever, at 7:30 in the morning. And the first thing we had to do is go into the basement, especially in the wintertime. And that was the spookiest basement that you ever wanted to be in when you were by yourself. And if I remember right, we had to open up this big, huge furnace, the door on it, reach in, bring the coal clinkers out, and put them in a bin to be taken away. Then we had to go into the coal cellar, which was underneath the alleyway in the back of the store, and bring the coal out by the shovelful and put it into the hopper from which it was taken into the furnace. And I don't think in all the years that I worked there, and probably when you worked there, that furnace ever broke down. I don't remember any furnace problems at all.
That basement was a story unto itself, because you went down, came back to the back of the store, went by Joe's desk, down these stairs, and down at the bottom was about a 40-watt light. And there was that I remember, there was nothing upstairs. And you got down to the bottom, and the room ahead was a lot less scarier than the one that went to the left. I don't know what was going on in that.
That was under the store next door.
Yeah. Oh, it was just spooky. You're right, down there. And somehow we survived. But Joe didn't spend a lot on lighting down in that basement.
You got out as fast as you could.
Yeah, I remember that basement too. It was spooky.
One of the things that Joe provided for the townspeople and also for the resorters was a rack of boxes like pigeonholes that took up pretty much all of one wall that people could reserve their newspapers in. So Don and I and several of the other people who were employed there in the morning would have to fold the papers and put them into the pigeonhole boxes. And a lot of people appreciated this, but there came times when they didn't come to pick them up. So we would have paper after paper after paper putting into these boxes, and finally we didn't have any more room. And people didn't realize unless they picked their papers up, we wouldn't be able to save them for them. And we also got very adept at looking at this tall thing that was on a metal, it was a metal sheet that was folded in and there was paper in it. And we would write the names of the people who got the type of paper, Detroit News, Detroit Free Press, Grand Rapids Press, and pretty soon we had it all memorized. So we would stand there, and by maybe 3 seconds, we would have newspapers in each box. But in the summertime, that got to be really quite a job because usually all of the boxes were filled up by that time. But speaking of the papers,
Yes.
sometimes we would come down on a Sunday, and they would be piled up in the alleyway, and we had to haul them in
Yep.
like a chain gang. And on Sundays especially, we had to lock the front door. We had to lock the back door because they came in 2 sections, the news sections and the feature sections, and we had to put them together. And that was a massive job for everybody. So one Venetian Sunday, we put together 800 papers. That's what the demand was at that time. And I remember we sold 800 papers, and that was when they were 25 cents
Yeah.
for the Sunday edition.
And we used to put them together on the soda fountain.
Right.
Line up all the sections and start at section G and then work our way up to the front page.
I remember once, I don't know if I was working with you, there were so many papers stacked up in the back in the alley when we arrived that we had to toss them into Joe's office, and then we had to climb over them to get to the other side to take them into the store.
I don't know if I was there, but there were a lot of papers.
That's right.
In the winter, it was a lot of fun
Always.
bringing them in.
And what was funny about having the doors locked in the morning was people were so impatient about getting their papers. They would pound on the windows, they would pound on the doors. There was profanity that we were keeping them from their papers and this. And you have never seen a newspaper make people so mad.
Exactly.
Well, I can remember best about Sunday morning was the first thing I did, even before the papers. Generally, because I'd been out the night before, just head right straight for the bromo seltzer machine, flip that baby in some water, and hope for the best. Go back and do the papers.
One Venetian Saturday, Venetian weekend, of course, was gigantic in Charlevoix. It was even, I think, bigger than it is now. But this is when Cokes were a dime, cigarettes were a quarter, papers were a quarter, sodas 20 cents. That day, this particular day in the 1950s, there was so much money in the cash register that Joe had to empty it out because we couldn't close the cash drawer.
It was a good thing.
And when he totaled it up the next day, there was over $1,000. And I think he was like a Macy's Thanksgiving Day balloon that got away. The man actually levitated because that would probably translate into close to $10,000 today. He was absolutely ecstatic at the business. But I remember on Venetian Saturday, we all had to work extra hours, and we probably worked until midnight because downtown was so busy. And the store was just sometimes wall-to-wall people on that night. And that was one of my greatest memories of Venetian Saturday in Charlevoix.
Yeah, you made a lot of ice cream cones on that weekend.
Sometimes
Yeah.
your arm was so sore you couldn't even
Yeah.
move.
Right.
Do you remember, we used to call it the initiation fee, right? Dorothy Armstrong and I, Dorothy was a former employee. when we get a new employee in, we wouldn't tell them about the milkshake mixer being above the metal
I have that in here.
Sink.
sink. Go ahead and tell
Well,
us.
I don't, I think you told me, it wasn't an issue, because I never got it. There was this big, long steel sink. And of course, the thing that made the milkshakes in was steel. And then you clamp it onto the machine. Did you get nailed by that?
Oh, yes.
I didn't.
Yes. You-
I did.
Yes.
I paid real close attention to what you said.
Of course, today you would be locked down and shut down until this was corrected.
Right.
But if your thigh, your thigh, your leg went up against the sink while your hand was on the milkshake canister, you would get a tremendous shock. And actually, a couple of times, people were taking it off and they got this shock, and the milkshake went round into the canister and went up onto the ceiling.
I believe it, but I never saw it.
That happened to an employee called Peggy once. She screamed and up went the
Oh,
milkshake.
Peggy, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. One thing I remember back then are the porcelain canisters. They were about like this, and they sloped out at an angle. And they put them into the soda fountain, and they had a spout on the top that you pressed down with your hand. And we had all of these flavors that went into sodas and Cokes, raspberry, lemon, lime, etc.,
Cherry,
etc.
yeah,
Cherry, yeah. And I've never seen that before. And I've never seen it since until I went to a soda fountain in Grayling, and all of a sudden, all this nostalgia of working for Joe's it was like a tidal wave.
Oh.
They have this 1953 soda fountain. Of course, your dad's, I think, went back to the 1930s. It was like a retro Art Deco soda fountain with all the curvy lines and
Right.
this.
I think
Do you have
that
any-
root beer machine went back to the 1900s. That was a beauty.
Yeah. So we had this Coke machine and we had this root beer machine, and we had to bring the syrup in that was in gallon jugs and tilt it up and pour the syrup in both machines.
Yep.
And we had an electric soup maker.
Um,
And can you describe that?
Well, it wasn't really that big. It was black, and it was probably, this wide?
Mm-hmm.
And we had individual servings of like Campbell soup, and you open the can, and then you'd pour it in these special little insulated, like a high mug, and but on the front of it had a prong or something?
Two prongs.
Two prongs, and the bottom panel was electric, and you'd push the prongs into the socket, and then you'd turn a little timer, and when the timer went off, like 1.5 minutes or whatever, and then your soup would be hot, and then you would pour it in a bowl, and there was a big jug of crackers there, and you would serve it like that. In fact, my husband and I still have one of those, but it's out at Atwood at our mini farm, and we couldn't get through all the snow to bring it in and show it, but hopefully we'll get it and it'll be displayed at Harsha House when the display goes up. But that was a big thing. We sold a lot of soup.
A lot of soup and a lot of coffee. The bank next door, as Don was talking about, the bank ladies would come through the back door in shifts for their coffee breaks. And so we were a coffee break place, we were a Coke place, we were a soup place. And if you were ever caught downtown and you needed some place to go, just to have lunch, to have a cup of coffee, to have a Coke, you just drifted automatically to Joe's. Now the two pharmacies also had soda fountains, but they didn't have the array of things that Joe's had that you could actually come in and have a meal.
Right.
So Phyllis, could you tell us how the store got started, how your dad ended up working for Mr. Myers, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes. My dad was born in Eastport in 1906. He lived in Ellsworth, and he came to Charlevoix in 1926. And at that time, he was associated with Mr. Fred Myers, who had this store down near the bridge in Charlevoix. And then in 1934, he purchased the business from Mr. Myers, and then it was moved to the location that we're going to be talking about today at 225 Bridge Street. He continued working for Mr. Myers after he purchased the business in 1945. And then again in 1965, the store was relocated across the street at 228 Bridge. But we're not talking about that, are we?
No.
Oh, okay. So anyway, that's how Williams Cigar Store became Williams Cigar Store. I just remember my dad had a store downtown, and it was like really busy, and always a lot of people there. And I was younger than like 6 or 7, and so. But when I was 10, then my dad said, "Well, you got to start working, and I want you to deliver newspapers." See, there comes the newspaper business into it again. And so he bought me a new bike with a big basket on the front of it. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, I had to be down to the store, and my dad would load my basket in my bike with the newspapers, and I had to go up the hill, across the bridge, up the hill to the Beach Hotel. And then I had to take my basket full of newspapers and take them inside and put them on their main desk. And then I was free to go and do my own thing with my friends until 2 o'clock again that same day in the afternoon. Then I had to be back for newspapers again, and then I had to deliver them down to the Belvedere Hotel. And those were the Chicago papers and the Wall Street Journal. And there was always the long porch at the Belvedere Hotel was always full of gentlemen waiting for their Wall Street Journal. So I did the same thing. I got off my bike, took the basket full of papers, took them in, put them on their counter, and then I was free to join my friends at Ferry Beach for a swim. So that was my first job at Dad's store.
My first impression of Joe's was going in with my father and getting the paper out of box 17 or whatever it was. And was kind of admiring the place. It had a cigar lighter.
Mm-hmm.
And it was up on a shelf, and it was on kind of an arm, and you pulled this thing out, and there was a big snap, and there was this galactic fire that came on. If you had the cigar in your mouth, you would light it. Whatever happened to that?
I don't know.
That was a beauty.
I don't know what happened to that.
That would be a real collector's item. Put that on Antiques Roadshow today, and it'd be worth a fortune.
Yeah, it was.
And nobody touched the cigar lighter except Joe.
Yeah.
We weren't allowed to service it. We weren't allowed to fill it. We weren't allowed to put the new batteries into it. That was Joe's baby. And another thing was directly back in the store, if you could see it, because there were all these knickknacks up above, was a huge Bull Durham sign. Mm-hmm. And Bull Durham was chewing tobacco. And that thing was in this huge frame. It was probably stood about 5 feet tall, hanging up there on the wall. And I'd love to know what happened to that thing too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't know what happened to all of that stuff. And Don talked about the cigar lighter. Behind the cigar lighter was a whole wall of cigars. And I don't know how my dad knew what to buy because he never smoked, to my knowledge. And they were all, had glass doors in front of them, so, right? Mm-hmm. So you couldn't just reach up there and grab a couple. You always had to move the door. And everybody remembers that old cigar lighter.
That was a beauty. And the most expensive cigars were right near the lighter.
Oh, yeah.
The beerings.
Oh, yeah.
30 cents or something.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Tailed on down to the RG Duns.
Another thing was, we had the community telephone, but we also had the community restroom. So anybody could come in and use the restroom.
That was akin to the basement. You only went in there when you had to. It was a small place.
It was like a closet. You could hardly turn around in it, but to get into it, you went into from the main part of the store, back by Joe's office, in 90 degrees, and there was the cleaning equipment on the one side, and we hung our coats on the wall on the other side. So you walked in sort of like this. You didn't have any elbow room. Well, one day, Charlevoix gets derelicts that come through the town, and one came through, and you could tell he was pretty much 4 sheets to the wind. The man was so handsome, he could have been a Hollywood movie star. And apparently he got wind of the fact that we had a free community toilet. So he walked in and he never walked out. And Joe was home for lunch at that time, and Dorothy Armstrong started to get a little bit panicky. So we called Joe and said, we got a problem on our hands. There's a man in the bathroom and he won't answer the knock on the door. So Joe came down and he pounded on the door also, and the man never responded. So we thought maybe he died. And that was the last thing Joe ever wanted, was for somebody to die in his store. So we called the police, and Glenn Pemberton and Earl Crandall came down. Glenn was short and stocky, and Earl was tall and lanky, and we called him Tootie and Muldoon after Car 54, where are you? So they said, well, we've got to get in there. So Joe went down to the basement and got either a screwdriver or a chisel and a hammer, and they took the pins out of the hinges, and so they could open the door from the other angle, and Earl reached around and undid the latch. So there was a pretty big crowd in the store by this time. And I still remember standing up by the nut machine and watching these two men backing out of this little vestibule with this door coming down on top of them. So they got it out, and Earl walked in, and we heard him starting to laugh, because there was the man sitting on the toilet with his pants around his ankles, leaning up against the wall, sound asleep. So they stood him up, pulled up his pants, and took him out, and he had to spend the night in jail because he was still so 4 sheets to the wind. And that's what they had to do with him, and then they sent him on his way the next day. My mother worked at the bank next door, and one day I had just turned 14, and I had been caddying at the Charlevoix golf course for 2 years, and my parents thought it was time I had a real job. And at that time, we still talk about this, my classmates and I, when we get together, because the culture of the town back then was, in the summertime, you worked.
Right.
There was no question about it. You got a job. No job in Charlevoix was any more valuable and it had any more status than any other job. You babysat, you mowed lawns, you worked downtown in a store, you caddied, you just simply worked. So it was time for me to start working. So she had come into the store every day. She had started full-time the year before, and she talked to Joe about the possibility of my working there. So he said, they're always looking for people, because the turnover, the help. And I went in and talked to him, and it took me a while to get my sea legs in the store, but after about 6 months I really caught on. And one thing that was unique about the store was our shifts. Now Don and I would open up, plus the other fellows who worked there too. And every other day we would either work till noon, come back at 6 and work till 10, 11, 12, whatever. The next day we would work from 7:30 to 9, be off until noon, and come in from the noon to 6 shift, and then work every other Sunday. So it worked out rather well that we had all of these different times off.
Right.
We had 3 evenings a week off. We'd have 3 afternoons a week off. So we'd go swimming, we could hang out with our friends, and it was a nice shift. But I remember about the afternoon shift that it began to drag around 4 o'clock, and you were watching the clock constantly if the store wasn't busy. If it was busy, time flew, because you didn't have time to look at the clock.
Right.
But in the off season, you were just praying for the day to get over.
I worked a lot at night with my dad, because my parents stayed at the cottage out at Ironton in the summertime.
Mhm.
And so my mom would come in quite often, but then Dad would come out for supper, and then I'd come back in with him. And we were supposed to be open till 10. But in those days, everybody took walks at night and wanted ice cream. And so we were supposed to be open till 10, but we were always there till at least 10:30. And then you had to close, and Dad had to sweep the floors and clean up a little bit. And it was always, I remember we always got really late going back to Ironton. Remember that.
Another thing that happened at Joe's was the comic book rack. It was stood about maybe 5 feet tall from floor up to maybe even 6 feet tall, filled with comic books. And the local kids would come in and they'd stand there and read them, and they wouldn't buy them. And it was a chronic problem because it drove your dad nuts.
I know, I remember that.
And then there was the time when Playboy hit the stands. And we had this big newspaper rack.
Oh.
And he really didn't know what to do
Right.
because the magazine distributor said, this is a hot item, you got to carry this. And your parents, being both devoutly religious people in the Methodist Church, it became sort of a problem. So I think in the beginning it was behind the scenes.
Oh,
And if anybody wanted one, they could ask for them.
okay.
But he finally got brave enough to put it out on the rack.
And I think the magazine company said, if you're gonna have magazines, you have to have this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you have them all, then you gotta have this one. I
Right.
remember that situation.
So we could feel the culture changing a little bit there.
Yeah, yeah.
I imagine the kids who came in to read the comic books probably couldn't afford to buy them. Because there wasn't a lot of money in Charlevoix
That's
back
right.
in the 50s.
Yeah.
That's right.
And
When we were working there, Charlevoix was just pulling itself up with industrial employment, with the coming in of Friedman Art Craft, which is now Harbor Industries, and then Kornstrom came in with the American Mold Engineering. But back then, when we were kids, it was the resort industry, do or die.
that was it.
And you lived on that every year for 2 months.
One of the things that I remember you teaching me, and you've forgotten about it because we talked about it a year or so ago. You had figured out what your father, Joe, what his code was for marking the price of an item on a little tag.
Oh,
And you figured it out. And
Yes.
It was tin for sale because there's not a repeating letter in there.
What was the code again?
Tin for
Tin
sale.
for sale, yeah. And each one was a number.
And if you sold something, then I guess we took the tag off and gave it to your father, and he figured out.
oh,
He knew what
Yeah.
the cost was, and he probably knew what it sold for. And,
okay.
but you don't remember that, huh?
I do remember it now
Yeah.
that you jogged my
Yeah.
memory. Do you remember inventory? When we had to take inventory every year.
I'm not sure I was involved in inventory.
I think there were sometimes we actually had to close the store for a few hours a day.
Probably,
Yeah.
yeah.
Because we had all of these 5 and dime knickknacks on cards that were hung all over the store. All top of all of the display racks, the display cases, hanging from wires from the ceiling. And they were like, I think we kept the Japanese economy afloat at this time because all of these little things you could buy
Right.
for 5 and 10 cents.
Probably got him from your dad.
He might have.
Through, he was a salesman for
Yeah.
CW Mills, yeah.
Mhm.
So,
And some of them, of course, didn't sell, and they would hang up there and get coated with dust.
Oh, yeah.
And we would have the annual house cleaning. I remember with my rag and my pan cleaning the shelves of the cigar cases.
Oh,
and
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But
There was always something to do, to
always, something,
stock or whatever.
always. There was so much stuff in that store.
I remember that your father, Joe, people would come in and say, "Well, Joe, how's business today?" And his remark was always the same. He said, "Well, it's steady by jerks." that was Joe's saying about business.
I think in probably every house in Charlevoix at one time or another, someone said to somebody else, let's go downtown and have a Coke at Joe's.
Yeah.
It was just the place to go. And a lot of people went to the drugstores because they were closer to their place of employment
Right.
or they knew the owner or so. But everybody at one time or another came to Joe's.
Yeah.
And one thing that I am very thankful to Joe is he took me aside when I first started and told me how to treat the customers. And it's a lesson I never forgot. Just be kind to them, be quiet, don't argue. And it was a valuable lesson, and because I was a pretty hot-headed kid, and something could set me
You?
off. Yes, I was, and I still can be. But I still remember it now as one of the first valuable lessons that I was taught. And I learned how to handle people.
Well, that business of not arguing was always put to the test in the summer.
Definitely, especially with the summer people.
Right.
Exactly.
Who have some of them have a very strong sense of entitlement.
I remember one thing, when you were talking about the fountain and filling everything, Dad made his own chocolate all the time, didn't he? In the back room?
Yes, as a matter of fact, he did. Yeah.
Because I remember when it would always smell so good, like chocolatey, or like when you walk into a bakery and everything smells so good.
Right.
And he had this little burner, like not a regular cook stove, but just a little gas burner or something that he. I can remember him standing back there and stirring it.
That was the chocolate syrup.
Yeah, yeah.
And he also made his own simple syrup,
Oh, yes, yes.
the simple syrup that then you would put the flavoring in.
Yes.
And, yeah. And the hot fudge, remember the hot fudge and the marshmallow
Oh,
machines?
yeah.
All that gooey mess that
Oh,
we
yeah.
ate all the time. I think I probably ate total maybe 30 gallons of ice cream. And I remember the ice creams coming, and we would put it in the reserve freezer, and then we had to
Right.
bring it out to soda fountain.
Right.
And you'd take the lid off of it, and you'd put the scoop on it, and you'd put the scoop on it, and nothing would happen. It was so hard. And by the time you got it up into a dish, and there were, 10 people waiting for their sundaes, and your arm was ready to fall off. It was so hard.
Especially on those busy days. We had the low counter, and then we had the back counter where we served the soup and food like that was higher with the higher bar stools on it. It was always busy. There was always somebody in there.
I have, in retrospect, a huge amount of fond memories of the place.
Oh, yeah.
I think about it all the time. And one thing that is amazing to me is I can walk in my mind, I can smell the place.
You can see where everything is. You know exactly.
I know where,
walking the
I
length
know
of it.
I can make a beeline for everything.
Yeah.
I probably knew every cubic inch of the place by the time I got done. And it was just simply a joy to work for your dad.
Oh, that's very nice of you to say that because, of course, I'm prejudiced. I thought he was the best dad ever, but it was a special place to go.
And I think every town needs one, and Charlevoix could certainly use a Joe's now.
Yeah,
Those days are gone, David. I'm sorry to tell you.
yeah, that's totally different.
Well, when a friend comes in from California and it's 8 o'clock at night and you say, let's go downtown and have a cup of coffee, and you walk downtown and the only place that you can get a cup of coffee is at the Subway store or the pub, Terry's Pub, and everything else is closed down. And this is in August. That's I think, a pretty sad commentary on how the town has evolved, because there's no Joe's, there's no place that is just there when you need it.
Right, right.
That's what it was to me.
Well, Joe understood return on assets. And, he's got an asset, a store here, and you might as well keep that baby open
Yep.
as long as you can and get as much out of it because the investment goes on. But your father was a very fair guy. That's what I remember.
Right,
He was just
right,
a nice guy.
right.
It
And he was
a pleasure-
nice to everybody.
Pleasure to work there.
He was known across the country, because I remember after the chauffeurs arrived, and then of course the summer people arrived, the number of people who would come into the store just to see your dad and say hello, we're back, we'll see you over the summer, and then before they left, they came in to say goodbye. And that's how highly regarded he was in the town.
Right.
He was a little rough around the edges. I don't know if did he have a high school education?
No,
Okay. But he
so he
made,
did good for himself.
he did very well for himself.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, both of you.
Thank you.